I can't actually hear them. You'll have to tell me. By the way, there are a few front row seats here. So if anyone wants to come up to the front, please feel free. Is it okay now? Can everybody hear me? No, they can't hear me.
I don't think you have PA, right?
Trudy, I'm so glad you're in the front. Uh-oh. Okay, good. Now can you hear me? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Front row seats are still available. Well, welcome this evening. I'm Linda Coleman, member of the Centennial Committee. The Centennial Committee has been pretty excited about this program for quite some time. It's been wonderful to see such a great response to a work of nonfiction and a book about Maine. Nan Colias, our director, said she knew this book was a great choice when she read it and couldn't put it down. So before we begin tonight's program, you all have a handout. We have just a couple of announcements. Along with a list of books recommended for further reading, you'll see some of our other Centennial events coming up. And I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of these. On Friday, April 8th, we have nationally acclaimed award-winning storyteller Len Gabral coming. He's going to be an evening of mime, poetry, song, and humor in his lively retelling of stories from around the world. And a program not to be missed by a crowd obviously interested in Maine history will be Thursday, May 5th. Come hear our own local historian and esteemed high school teacher, Alan Hall, give an overview of our community at the turn of the century with a new library at its center. After Colin's talk this evening, he'll be taking questions, and we'll be giving away a couple of copies of, giving away a couple of our Centennial bags, our lovely Centennial bags, as well as a signed copy of the book that people have been filling out slips for quite some time at the library. And we do have copies of books for sale as well. I'd like to thank Bob Wood, who is taping the program this evening, and he did remind us that anyone with questions is encouraged to come up to the mic so that the people who watch this at home can hear. Okay, so we'll begin tonight's program. When the 18th century began, only the very wealthy and the clergy had access to large numbers of books. But on July 1st, 1731, Ben Franklin and a group of his associates formed a library and chose as their motto, "To support the common good is divine." It didn't take our Centennial Committee long to realize that what we really are celebrating during Memorial Library's 100th year is community. A group of people living in a small town sharing common interests. For our One Town, One Book program, the Chamber of Commerce made 80 copies of the Lobster Coast available around town. We had 20 copies with a long reserve list in constant circulation at the library. Local bookstores sold nearly 150 more copies. We are doing more than sharing a book with this program. Reading the same book at the same time, through shared experience, we are building community. Colin Woodward's The Lobster Coast has us thinking about community again and again. In the chapter entitled Triumph of the Commons, he says, researchers have discovered scores of successful community-managed property arrangements from the jungles of India and Southeast Asia to the submerged coral reefs surrounding the tiny islands of the Central Pacific. It turns out that in some situations, the village way of doing things works a whole lot better than either privatization or draconian government intervention. He then goes on to say this brings us back to Maine. Unbeknownst to most lobstermen, the Maine lobster fishery has become the source of great excitement and revelation for many of the world's leading property theorists. The traditional system by which Maine and Maritime's lobstermen have long managed their fishery has literally become a textbook example of how communities successfully protect and defend the resources they depend upon. The Lobster Coast is a good read for many reasons. I know one of the reasons I found the book so compelling is that, like Colin Woodward, I was born and raised in Maine. Except for a 9-month stint in flat, tame, landlocked Columbus, Ohio, I've lived here all my life. Bangor, China, North Haven, Mapleton, Limestone, Rangeley, Augusta, and for the last number of years, Yarmouth. I'm proud to call Maine my home, and this book helped me to understand all the more the roots of this pride. Part history, part ecological fable, says a publisher, the Lobster Coast tells a story as big as America itself, one with poignant lessons for the inhabitants of a rapidly shrinking world. Here tonight to discuss his book with us is Colin Woodward. Colin is a self-employed writer and an award-winning journalist. He has reported from more than 40 foreign countries and 6 continents. He is currently a science and international news correspondent for the Chronicle of Higher Education and a regular contributor to the Christian Science Monitor. He has covered a wide range of peace issues, from ethnic conflict in the Balkans and peacekeeping in Guatemala to the destruction of coral reefs and the effects of global warming on Antarctica. Since 1989, he's been based in Budapest, Hungary, Zagreb, Croatia, Washington, D.C., and on the U.S.-Mexico border near Brownville, Texas. He is a graduate of Tufts University and the University of Chicago. He currently lives right here in Portland, Maine. And as I said, Colin will be signing copies of The Lobster Coast, as well as his first book, Ocean's End, Travels Through Endangered Seas, after this talk. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to the author of The Lobster Coast, Rebels, Rusticators, and the Struggle for a Forgotten Frontier, Colin Woodward.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I'm very pleased that Yarmouth has selected the Lobster Coast for its One Book, One Town program. It's wonderful to have an entire community reading it at once. As many of you are already aware, the Lobster Coast is, I guess I describe it as the story of Maine past, present, and future. And as such, it's primarily a history book. But it's a history book in which a good third of the book takes place in the present. I mean, it starts in the present, it works out in the present. It has something to do with the way I kind of look on history. I mean, I think when people hear the word history, their eyes kind of glaze over a bit because they're remembering, their history classes in public school. I mean, I certainly remember mine were incredibly dry because history was taught as this sort of collection of irrelevant facts about the past that seemed to have no connection with your own lives, which you had to memorize in time for a test, Who won the Battle of Thermopylae, and what was Emperor Xerxes known to eat as breakfast cereal, and those kind of things that didn't actually connect with your own lives. And I've always thought that that is a great shame because, I later majored in history and obviously have an interest in history and find it so compelling, but it's compelling because it tells you so much about where we are now. I mean, you go to a foreign country and you look around and, why are this group of people behaving in this seemingly bizarre way towards that group of people? Why are the buildings built this way? Why are the doors open in that direction? Why do people in this place not allow you to toast with beer glasses? All of these strange nuances and stuff are all, you can learn why that is by looking back into the past. And it's in that spirit that I wrote The Lobster Coast. It's a history, but it's a history in which I'm standing in the present and reaching back through the spectrum of history to try to understand where we are today and how it all came to be this way. Another thing I think is unfortunate about the way history is taught, particularly in this country, is there's the sort of power of myth. And it particularly afflicts the colonial history of the United States, in that I remember in my high school curriculum, the history of the United States seemed to start in 1620, with the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. And then suddenly you fast forwarded to, the French and Indian War and the Revolution. And there was this 150-year chunk that's just missing. What happened there? And the more you start looking at that missing 150-year chunk, the stranger and stranger the story gets, because it's not at all what you expect to find. I mean, there are very few links between the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock and the French and Indian War breaking out, in the 1760s. In between there, the more you look at it, the more it seems like a complete fluke, a random event that the United States turned out the way it did. Because at the beginning, the colonies are at each other's throats. And I don't just mean that the Dutch colonies and the French colonies are at the English colonies' throats. The English colonies themselves are at war often, because they're settled by people from completely different strata of English society. They're coming from different parts of the country generally, ruled by people from very different social spheres and with completely different goals and missions in mind for the colony. Virginia and Maryland are constantly at war, one Catholic, one Anglican. Closer to home, though, we have the story of Maine and Massachusetts. And Maine and Massachusetts, you may not be surprised, were settled by people from very different strata of English society. In fact, they were settled from two leadership groups who were at the opposite sides of an emerging conflict in England. Because while colonization was going on, this part of the world was colonized, in the early 1600s, and at that time, England was sort of careening towards the English Civil War. And the people who were guiding the settlement of these two colonies were drawn from the opposite ends of English society and the opposite ends of the conflict which would become the English Civil War. Maine, for its part, was settled largely through the efforts and ambitions and planning of an errant English knight, Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Now, Sir Ferdinando is sort of one end of the spectrum of English society before the English Civil War. He's very much into tradition in the sort of King Arthur, Tolkien kind of English tradition of, knights and swords and honor and peasants on the land and serving up their, ties to the barons who pass it on up through the noble chain and service to the king and to the established church, which was the Anglican church. So he was very royalist and Anglican in his persuasions. Now he had a problem, however. As much as he loved the trappings of the sort of Middle Ages, which were dying out at this period. Remember, England's 1600s, you're kind of at that juncture between the Middle Ages and modernism. It's kind of in between somewhere. And that's what the English Civil War is really about. It's about a conflict between those two things. And Sir Ferdinando Gorges would love to turn back the clock and go back to something more of those good old Middle Ages. But he's got this problem. He's not born into his title. He was given his title for heroics on the battlefield in continental Europe in the wars in the Netherlands. So he didn't get his knighthood. His knighthood did not come with landed estates. He wasn't a landed aristocrat. And this clearly really, really bummed him out. He had these dreams that he himself would also have, a realm of his own, the realm of Gorges. And so he had been sort of stewing over this for a long time and got involved kind of by accident. He was from the West Country, Devon, Dorset, Cornwall, that part of England, and was involved in financing some of the early reconnaissance missions to go explore this strange continent that the Europeans had bumped into on their way to try to find Asia. And his reconnaissance missions that he had sort of invested in happened to, sort of by happenstance and really storm weather, ended up exploring the Maine coast. You read the reports when they finally came back to him, and he started hatching this idea in his head. He had this idea, what if I recreated the sort of my medieval dream in the new world, in this new continent that's just been discovered? And so he had enough political connections and was in good with the king and managed to get a charter and the paperwork that basically made him lord of this domain he'd never seen. And he was given basically the rights at one point where he was not answerable to Parliament or anybody except the crown himself. He really was the lord of all this domain. And this domain we're talking about is all of what the British were claiming in North America, from just north of the Virginia colony all the way through, in theory, to Newfoundland. I mean, an enormous swath of territory. And all of this, in Sir Ferdinando Gorges's master plan, was to be ruled not from Boston or New York, but from the village that is now York, Maine. That was the center of it all. He named it at a certain point Gorgiana after himself, which may tell you something about his personality. But without ever visiting, he spent enormous amounts of money and enormous effort trying to build his dream. And his dream was that he was sending all these early fishing stations you've heard about that predate the Pilgrims' arrival and the failed Popham colony that was out the mouth of the Kennebec. These are all things that he tried to produce in his effort to get his colonial scheme going. And in his dream, he would be at the top of the scheme, and then he would hand out to worthy people, dukedoms, and each of the duchies would have counts, and he would hand out counties, and the counts would have barons who reported, and the baronies would be divided into hundreds, and on the hundreds would be all the indentured servants upon the land, It would be the good old days, finally get rid of this corruption of modernism and so on and so forth. So he was busy trying to do this. Well, Massachusetts was settled by a very different group of people. In fact, people at the other extreme opposite of English society. Because, well, Ferdinand of Gorges' part of the country, the west of England, the north of England, was very traditional, much more that sort of earthy Tolkienian perspective, and lots of large landed estates, and very few people had their own land, were still sort of indentured servants. They weren't officially serfs, but in effect, they were still permanent renters of their land. Well, the eastern part of the country, East Anglia, the extreme eastern bit, which is close to the continent, was quite the opposite. This was the part that was influenced the most by the Netherlands right across the English Channel. Now, the Netherlands, Holland at the time, was the most advanced state in Europe. I mean, it was the first republic. They'd 80, 100 years earlier had actually overthrown the king of Spain and just said, we'll run things ourselves, and just created a republic and a commercial system and started setting up global corporations which were trading around the world, the East India Company and such. I mean, they were way, way ahead of their times, and also a solidly Calvinist influence. And all those commercial influences and stuff had come across the narrow channel to England, and East Anglia was sort of the most advanced part of England in a modern sense. This was the commercial part. This is where the most physicians and lawyers and people who own freehold property and cottage industries, and it was sort of the beginnings of sort of proto-capitalism were all headquartered there. Quite the opposite extreme, and the people there were chafing under the restrictions of guilds and medieval tithes and all these things which were just making the business of getting business done a real pain in the neck. They wanted, although they didn't call it at the time they wanted to modernize. They wanted to push towards something more recognizably capitalism. Now, a lot of the people involved in this were Calvinists, people that we would call Puritans, and many of their political leaders in Parliament, in this emerging conflict, which affected Parliament as well, were also Calvinists from this part of the country who were advocating for these changes. Sort of Protestant work ethic was very much at work within the Puritan camp. But there were certain groups of very extreme Puritans who wanted to broker no compromise with anyone in England. And when they heard about all these reconnaissance trips coming back from places like New England, they had an idea. Why don't we go to the New England wilderness and create a Calvinist religious utopia? Yes, we'll take the Bible and our interpretations through John Calvin, and we will build an applied religious state in the wilderness of this new continent we just bumped into. We'll build a light on the hill, a new Zion, a beacon to humanity to finally get rid of their wasted ways and finally see the light of Calvinism. And so they were going to the New World with very organized settlements around strict religious principles. You'd better wash your car on Wednesday between 2 and 3 or else you're going in the stock. And not anyone could show up, whereas in the colonies in Maine and Virginia, they would basically take any colonist who had more than one leg, here, have a shovel, get out there and start working. There were strict religious requirements you had to apply to. You had to be, doctrinaire and accepted into the church and pass all these tests to show that you were truly with the one accepted church of the colony. It was not, you often heard in our mythic explanation of history that, these people fleeing oppression at home came and founded, our wonderful pluralistic democratic state. No, they were fleeing persecution and set up a state in which nobody who wasn't their religion was allowed in. I mean, you ever wonder where Rhode Island came from? Roger Williams was kicked out because he wasn't strictly doctrinaire enough, was making crazy arguments like you ought to give the Indians payment for the land you take from them. So, out you go. You can imagine these two colonies, Massachusetts and Maine, side by side, the tensions that were going on. Not to mention the fact that back at home, a civil war is brewing that is going to place these two colonies at opposite ends of a major conflict. Well, shouldn't have been too much of a problem, right? Because the Massachusetts colony kind of got underway kind of by a bureaucratic accident in George's camp. Remember, he owned all this land, but he wasn't paying attention when he handed out a land grant to a shell company that actually represented these guys. And he didn't find out until it was too late. But he figured it was okay because he was the official colony, the king was at his back, and everything should be all right. But his plans were so wayward. I mean, Sir Ferdinand of Gorges, worked for most of his life trying to found this empire, and he had never once been to the New World. I mean, he never saw any of these places. So, many of his schemes were collapsing. A lot of these fishing stations failed. The Popham colony failed. And, by the 1630s, when the major Puritan migration began to Massachusetts, he had been working for 25 years trying to settle his domain. He had about 7,000 people in all of New England, including the Pilgrims in Cape Cod, by the time the Puritan migration began. And his colonial, workings were so wayward that, at one point he sends his nephew, who's just out of college, Thomas Gorges, to go rule in his stead as lieutenant governor, and he shows up in York and Georgiana, and steps off the boat expecting to see this great big imperial city with cathedrals and paved streets and sheriffs and dukes and counts and baronies and stuff, and instead confronted with this ramshackle fishing settlement with a bunch of our guys living, in hovels, being eaten to death by mosquitoes with wolves walking around at the edge of the settlement, killing all the livestock. He walks up to the manor house, Point Christian, which he expects to be, here's the great manor of Sir Ferdinando Gorges, where he's supposed to live. And he steps off and he starts writing, "Things are not as they appear." He writes a letter back to his uncle that says, "The manor house is very much like your barn." I can't remember what he says in it, but it's something like, it's furnished with a stool and a board and a rock, that kind of thing. So things were very much not as they appear. He'd be scribbling out these notes and sending them back on the ship. But remember, in these days, there was no internet or telephone. Things moved only as fast as that ship. So, you write a note out, and it's going to be 6 to 15 weeks if the ship makes it before it even gets back to Sir Ferdinando Gorges. And even if he writes back the same day, it's going to be another 6 to 15 weeks before you hear back from him. So, he'd run down, Thomas Gorges would run down to the dock, things are not as they appear, blah, 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 and he'd receive the packet from the ship who's just arrived that would open it up and would say something like, "Build a new cathedral, hire 40 sheriffs." So it was this sort of disconnect that was sort of causing Maine and the official colonies to not be very successful. Well, not so Massachusetts Bay, because within a few years of the beginning of the Puritan migration in the 1630s, there were not 7,000 people. In just a few years, there were 25,000 Puritans in Massachusetts Bay. And suddenly, the little rogue colony had already expanded bigger than the entire New England ambitions of Gorges over the past 20 years. And he was worried, what do I do? But he didn't get a chance to do anything about it. Because lo and behold, in the 1640s, the English Civil War breaks out. And not only does it break out, but the king loses. In fact, the king gets his head lopped off, French style. And England actually has its first and only republic in its history, the Republic of Cromwell. And the rogue colony is suddenly the official colony. And the official colony, ruled out of York, Maine, was suddenly the rogue colony. Now, the settlements in Maine, which at that time were basically from Kittery to Wells, all those little towns, Kittery and York and Wells and so on and so forth. And they were, the nephew had actually left to go fight in the wars, and they were actually left completely on their own. They had no government at all for a number of years. They'd get together each town and in their whatever meeting space they could, and actually were writing charters to govern themselves. That was how desperate the situation had become there. So after the English Civil War ends, Massachusetts looks at Maine with very covetous eyes, and they want to eliminate Maine for a couple of reasons. Not only for the political differences, but for some very important differences in the way the two colonies are behaving towards the native inhabitants of the region. Because in Massachusetts, for theological reasons, the forest and the wilderness was looked upon as sort of Satan's realm, the sort of devil's realm. That's where, until you show up and actually lay things into cultivation, they're still out there in the wicked, feral world of Pan and pipes and satyrs and all that, We'll have none of that. But the people living in the woods, those must, by logic, therefore, be Satan's children. And so the Indians were looked upon as very dangerous, suspect creatures. They were living in the wild. They weren't doing the Lord's work plowing. They were seemingly moving around aimlessly, following animals and things. And it really bothered them that the Maine settlements, it wasn't like they were incredibly magically enlightened, but in Maine, they weren't there for applied theological mission. They were there basically to try to make enough money to get this crazy enterprise of Gorges off the ground. So they were busy, trying to establish, fish and lay out stuff and do salt cod and try to trade on the rivers with the Indians for beaver pelts, which were enormously valuable, which they would send back to England. So they were having to have good trade relationships with the Indians just for practical purposes. And they were pretty practical-minded colonies. But from the perspective of the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were flirting with Satan. As one of the leaders said at one point, you know, the settlers of the eastern territories are resembling too much the Indians which they have replaced, you know. This notion that they were sinking into savagery. So, right after the wars in the 1650s, Massachusetts forcibly annexes the Maine settlements. They send in actually, you know, magistrates backed by troops to each town, and the town meetings in most of these cases, you know, which are only, the only documents are kept by Massachusetts Bay now, but the documents, you kind of read in between the lines. It's like, you know, the town meets and everyone is opposed to joining Massachusetts, and then we put it to them again, and the soldiers stood at the door, and then everyone voted for joining Massachusetts, yeah. Including the guy who just gave the big speech about how this would be terrible. He was first on the list with a shaky hand. Repeated over and over again. They'd be like, you know, 4 days of revotes until you voted yes. That kind of stuff. So a forcible annexation. And Maine became something very strange in American history. It became a colony of a colony. Because Maine was a separate colony before that. In fact, the official colony. And it was taken over by people with absolutely different aims and from a different culture, who ruled over Maine from the 1650s until statehood in 1820, and ruled Maine with, like all empires do, with the interests of the center in mind, not the interests of the colony. And Maine entered into a colonial period. I think that's another thing that's not appreciated properly in Maine, is that Maine is a post-colonial society. And it did happen a while ago, but a lot of these dynamics you see, I mean, those of you who have grown up in Maine probably have this experience where, you know, if a car cuts you off, it's one thing, but if the car cuts you off and it happens to have Massachusetts license plates, you know, this strange thing happens to you that makes no sense, you know. You wouldn't react that way if it had Vermont license plate or Connecticut license plate, but somehow it's Massachusetts license plate, you know, it triples the anger level. There's something back there in the cultural framework. I mean, it's not DNA, it happens to me, and my parents are from away. I think we get it maybe from our classmates or something, but this sort of colonial dynamic and resentment towards Massachusetts as a sort of imperial center. And when you start looking at it in terms of, like, you know, the British in India, you start seeing it through that lens, it starts making a little more sense, the sort of perspective. Because during that time period was an incredibly tragic period for the people living on the coast of Maine. And the first reason was that no sooner did Massachusetts absorb these settlements than, because of some of these theological reasons and the sort of covetousness and greed of a few leading officials in Massachusetts, they launched a series of provoked and genocidal wars against New England's Indians. And in those wars, the Maine settlements ended up paying the brunt of the price, because it was a frontier settlement, and each time these wars would break out, basically all of the settlements in Maine north of Wells would be wiped out repeatedly. So, and everyone who couldn't escape, you know, if you didn't run fast enough, you were dead, and if you escaped, your town was burnt, and you fled out to Monhegan and then tried to make it to Boston, which was then choked with refugees. And this happened over and over again, starting in 1676. There'd be a war, everyone would be pushed off their land. 15, 20 years later, after massacres on both sides, the war would end. A few people would go back to their land, or children would go back to their parents' land and chop down the 20-year growth of forest and finally get the rocks out of the fields and fight the mosquitoes and so on and so forth and get their first crops out. And then another war would break out and they'd flee their homes and everything would be burned down. And the cycle was repeated again and again for about 80 years. Maine was, like the killing fields. You couldn't live here. I mean, even the surviving settlements in the South were being raided constantly. You had to flee out of the fields constantly and hide in the strong house for fear of being killed. And when you look out and you wonder, why is it in the Northeast that the coast of Maine has all of this sort of relatively wild open land compared to everywhere else? It's because for 80 years, the rest of the country was developing and Maine couldn't because it was a battleground. So no sooner did these Indian wars end in the 1730s, 1760s, it trailed on, then some of the leading figures in Massachusetts started devising some other plans for the state. Because they saw that during these Indian Wars for 80 years, Massachusetts' population was expanding, and there was not a lot of growing room, and it was very clear that when the Indian Wars ended, that the lands, the frontier lands in Maine, were suddenly going to become enormously valuable, and that a great deal of money could be made from real estate speculation if you got in early and bought big chunks. So, a number of leading officials in Massachusetts started hatching enormous land speculation schemes. Now, the people who were involved were like the governor of Massachusetts, and the guy who was governor of Massachusetts, and the guy who was going to be governor of Massachusetts, and the leader of the Massachusetts Assembly, and so on and so forth. I mean, it made Enron look like a very above-the-board sort of deal. And the deals would go sort of like, come down to the pub, I'll buy you a beer, and here, have 2 million acres of frontier land on the Maine coast. These huge patents and blocks of land were being transferred back and forth between people who had the right connections. And these people are the people who many of our towns and counties are now named after, because they tended to name them after themselves while they were still alive. You've got, Gardner, Waldo, Knox, Bowdoin, Vassal. These are all some of the leading property speculators at the time period. The problem was that the lands they were speculating in were not actually uninhabited frontier land. And I'm not just talking about the Indians. The lands, as I've described, these people who kept being pushed off the lands kept coming back during the Indian Wars. And some of them had actually lost their deeds because they'd been burned down when the farmhouse went. And others had deeds, but they came from, weird, the Sir Ferdinando Gorges, or from one of these chartered towns during the period when there was no government. It was all a little murky, and then, you were wiped out by French raiders, and therefore maybe your title's very confusing legal environment. But from these people's point of view, this was land that they'd paid for with their blood for generations. And then there were other people who had actually come from Massachusetts because they were tired of washing their car on Wednesday between 1 and 3 and wanted to go somewhere else, and Maine was the easiest place to get to between many of these wars. If you didn't have many resources at a time when there weren't cars or railroads, you could just hop on a boat and go up to the Maine coast, go down east, downwind, and just show up at a coastal settlement. So it's like the easiest place to get to. And you would then march out past the last town and go out in the woods and carve yourself out a farm. Now, the people didn't see this as squatting because, well, what is property? Well, at the time, the thinking was a sort of natural right. The sort of philosophy was, God made everything, and then things started becoming individual property when they were first put into productive use. When you first tilled the land, if you were the first person to till the land, you have just made property out of nothing, out of something that wasn't property before. So to them, this was the classic situation, because the Indians didn't count, where they were going and making property. So imagine how shocked they were when they've gone and made this property and cut down the trees and been eaten by the mosquitoes and chased the wolves out, when some guy shows up from Massachusetts saying, "Hi, I've been sent by Sir Gardner or Bowdoin or somebody, and you don't own this land at all. In fact, he does. And you owe him 37 years of back rent." You can imagine the expressions they must have had on their faces. But Maine was remote enough, and it had an infusion of Scotch-Irish settlement from the frontiers of Ulster and Scotland, which had maybe a little bit more of a vigorous frontier fighting spirit, that the settlers actually resisted. And in fact, it sparked another 80 years of armed resistance against the ambitions of the land speculators, where they were tarring and feathering any surveyor who tried to show up in the area, terrorizing the landowners themselves if they showed up, and actually managed during this long period before and after the Revolution to keep the land speculators at bay, and eventually were one of the main triggers for the state of Maine managing to pass a referendum to secede from Massachusetts in 1820. The other has to do with Massachusetts' relationship and behavior during the War of 1812, but we won't get into all that. So these things actually triggered Maine becoming independent again. Now, this period, if you ever wondered, remember the good old days on the Maine coast? Well, the good old days on the Maine coast, if you had to pick a golden age, it was probably the first 40 years after independence in 1820. Why? Because Maine at that time had an influence on the national economy greater than at any time before, and certainly will ever have again. Because at the time, the nation's commerce was still generally moving north to south, in the holds of wooden sailing vessels. And Maine's peculiar geography, with all of these enormous amounts of deep water harbors where the land falls off immediately into a deep anchorage where you can practically tie up to the shore without running aground, and the shore is covered in the perfect sort of wood and pitch and tar and things you need to actually build ships. Maine had become the shipbuilding center for much of the country. So many of the ships carrying these goods were Maine-built ships, which were owned by Mainers and often crewed by Mainers because of the long fishing history. And not only that, they were tended to be carrying in their holds all sorts of goods from Maine, because Maine at the time was a storehouse for all of the things that the expanding cities of the eastern seaboard needed at the time, because people were still building with granite. In fact, they were paving the streets with granite cobblestones. And what is Maine if not a large chunks of granite? I mean, you could pull up to an island, a large chunk of granite, pull your barge right up against the island, set up a quarry, and lift these enormous blocks right onto the barge, and just carry it right down to your construction site. If you're building the Brooklyn Bridge, or the Philadelphia Library, or the Library of Congress, or the Washington Monument, all of these buildings were built with Penobscot Bay granite. There was also ice, because people in southern climates particularly had suddenly discovered, gosh, it's nice to have refrigerated food and maybe a few ice cubes in that gin and tonic. And they were building ice houses to actually store these things during the summer so you could have some early refrigeration. But you needed the ice, because there isn't much of it in Mississippi and Alabama. But Maine had all of these enormous river systems and this jagged, lakes and such near river systems, and incredibly cold climate. So you had an enormous stock of thick, clean ice. And so they were an entire ice industry built around that. There was fish, because Maine was the center of the salt cod fishery in New England. And at the time, the only sort of animal protein source that poor people could afford was fish. And that was sort of the protein supplement for the poor, sent everywhere. Well, unfortunately, all of these industries collapsed practically on the same day after the Civil War, because at almost the same moment, somebody invented concrete, somebody invented artificial refrigeration, somebody invented steel-hulled steamships, which tended to be built in England, and lo and behold, people in the cities suddenly discovered that fresh fish does taste a lot better than salt cod and wanted fresh fish. And Maine was just a little bit too far in the technology of the day to get the fish to Boston or New York while it was still fresh. So the fishing industry migrated closer to those places, to places like Cape Ann and Gloucester instead of Maine. And the Maine fisheries were in trouble. But what really did in Maine's economy and turned it into the backwater that it remained is that commerce was no longer moving north to south in wooden vessels or any other vessels. It was moving east to west on the newly expanding railroads. And suddenly even farmers were competing directly with farms in places like Ohio that actually had topsoil. In fact, the farmers in Ohio could get their topsoil grown crops to Boston faster than people in Maine could, because they had access to the railroads. And railroad building in Maine was stunted because, well, first of all, we're in the wrong direction. We're not on the way to anything. We're a little east and north of the rest of the country. And there's no major population centers, so the economics of train building are not very good. But what really made it terrible is if you want to reach some little community down the way and you're building a railroad, it seems like every 100 yards you hit another one of those jagged rivers and estuaries and you got to build another bridge. So the railroads were very slow in coming in this direction. And Maine fell into a backwater and an economic depression so profound that many parts of the state have yet to emerge from it. In fact, even in somewhere like Portland or here, I don't think we really emerged from that depression until the 1980s. You're talking a century-and-a-half long economic depression. And it's affected and scarred our society in many, many ways because the desperation and poverty has lasted so long. To illustrate it, we tend to forget, even those who grew up here, what it was like even, in the 70s and the like. But all the way up till the early 1980s, if you look at statistics on per capita income adjusted for the cost of living because of the high heating costs up here, Maine was consistently finishing last of the 50 states in surveys of poverty and income. or second to last, or third to last, but in a constant battle year to year with Louisiana and Mississippi at the bottom of the nation. That's how profoundly poor it really was. Now, one final thing, one final irony I'll mention before I'll open things up to questions, is that it was at this time, when all of this economy had just collapsed, that the outside world discovered the pleasures of the Maine summer vacation. Imagine, it's the late 19th century. Now, the first people who came to summer in Maine were the very richest people in the country, because in the late 19th century, they were the only people who had what we might call a vacation. There was no 40-hour work week or any weekends or anything like that. Maybe we won't have them again, but there weren't any at the time. And so actually they followed painters. And painters in the Romantic era came, and like Frederick Church and others, and painted places like Mount Desert Island and the islands in Penobscot Bay and these bold lighthouses, and people saw these incredible landscapes and the salons of Philadelphia and New York and Boston and said, gosh, I'd love to see those things, and many of them did. And they liked what they saw so much, it was so beautiful, that they came and built these enormous rambling summer mansions to spend the summers there, away from the cities. Because the cities at the time, it was the late 19th century, that there was no Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act then. Well, maybe we won't have one in the future, but there was none then. And the cities were, Sherlock Holmesian polluted. You're talking black soot falling down and everything, and no sanitation yet, and horses going around, crapping in the streets, and just a total, mess. And to make matters worse, for people who, at the height of society, were seeing all of these unpleasant changes, because there are all these strange people arriving into their ports and changing the character of their cities. Where was the old New England now that there are all these people showing up who were strange things like Catholic and speaking languages? Who ever heard of this French and Gaelic and Italian? Oh my gosh, the whole world's coming apart. And whatever happened to that Protestant New England of town meetings and Yankee Magazine? Where is it gone? But then they show up at their summer homes, and there it was. There was that English Protestant golden age dream of New England that they kind of remembered from their childhoods before all of this immigration to the factories they own made them rich. That New England, here it is. We can come here and escape all that madness in the cities and recharge our batteries. It's a place where life is as it should be. So they came up literally to roll back the clock, to rusticate. They called themselves the rusticators, and they would live in rustic mansions with staff. And soon enough, they were followed by professors and others who actually had the summers off. And then as time passed, the middle class came. And it was only actually in the last phase with automobiles and such that ordinary people were able to start coming for weekend trips and such. But that's what got the Maine summer trade going. But you can imagine the sort of disconnect and dynamic that was going on in these communities at the time. We had some of the most powerful, well-connected people in the country showing up, googly-eyed at the abandoned farms with the weather-beaten houses with the beautiful fields of wildflowers outside, and the local people saying, yeah, that's the Joneses' farm. They lost everything and had to leave, as paupers to Ohio. It's a failed farm. Maine wasn't a pre-industrial utopia. It had just deindustrialized and was undergoing an economic tragedy of enormous proportions. All of these communities were actually emptying out. The populations of the counties along Penobscot Bay were decreasing in population and hemorrhaging people who were fleeing down the railroads to Ohio, where they heard there was something called topsoil. So the summer people, though, didn't want their dream to change either. So with the best intentions in mind, many of the summer colonies and communities were taking steps to ensure that the place didn't change, meaning that no factories did come, and there would not be any immigrants coming to the coast as well if there weren't any factories, and things wouldn't be all messy and noisy, and there wouldn't be the pollution and stuff, and took many steps to ensure that didn't happen. In fact, it got so extreme that all the way up until the early 20th century, many of the colonies, including Castine and Bar Harbor and Islesboro, were taking steps to prevent this horrible invention, the automobile, from ever being used in the towns. Even in the winter when they weren't there, they were prohibiting it. And long after the automobiles were being used in the mainland, in fact, these people were driving themselves to the train depot or the steamship depot in their cars, but the islanders in places like Islesboro, which is 12 miles long, weren't allowed to use vehicles because of this. And you can imagine the friction. Bridges, heaven forbid there be a bridge built here that'll destroy everything on the other side of the Kennebec River. It'll never be the same, and we'll leave. Those things actually go on in the editorial pages of newspapers. Whereas for the people who are there, they're in the middle of an economic depression, and yet dependent increasingly, without any other options, on the presence of the summer people to survive the winter cycle. And it's created some dynamics, some sort of two paradigms and worldviews that unfortunately still inform a lot of the debate in Maine. And both have a lot of truth in them because Maine has escaped a lot of the excesses and madness of East Coast society or American society in general. It is a place where, I think is sort of healthier and more grounded. And that's enormously valuable to people who are coming, who've seen how fast things can change and be rolled over, who look at a community and know that if you don't watch it right now, it's going to look like Saugus or Nantucket, depending on your situation, before you know it in a flash. Whereas people who've been weathering the 150-year-long depression, jobs are of enormous importance, Give us some jobs. It's been 150 years. And while both groups care about the towns, I think unfortunately in the change in paradigms, which informs debates you hear about bypasses in Wiscasset, about casinos, about almost any matter connected with development or zoning, breaks down over and over again into sort of two camps with one emphasis or the other. And I think that's unfortunate because the two groups actually have a lot in common if they were able to see where the other side is coming from. The commonality of interest is enormous. It's just both sides need to reimagine where the other people are standing. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping that the Lobster Coast can help do, because I've tried to write it in a fashion that that will inform people as to the historical background on all sides to what made the coast what it is today. Whether you arrived here last year and love the place, or from an 8th generation family, I think there's not a proper understanding of what came before and why those frictions are there, and what it is that's really unique about this place that one would hope can be preserved and protected if everyone gets on the same page, I guess. So that's all I had to say for now, and I wanted to open it up for questions. Any brave souls? Yes, please. If you can get there, I'll repeat your question for them if it's hard to get there. We're apparently taping for community access.
You didn't get to much about the lobsters or the fish. Mm-hmm. I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
One, what's your view of the 800 trap limit? I've heard some say that it's unfair to the bigger guys and creates an open door for the little guys. And secondly, you spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the fisheries,
Yep.
the offshore fisheries, and clearly it's a very difficult situation. Just yesterday there was a article by a conservation law person in the Telegram giving the worst case scenario and so forth. So could you comment on that and what your view is how to solve that problem?
Yeah, thank you. Marine issues are very dear to my heart. My first book, which some of you may be interested in, is a worldwide look at the collapse of world ocean systems, where I actually spent 6 weeks in Antarctica and Belize and elsewhere in Newfoundland where the Grand Banks collapse happened and the like. And there is a bunch in this about the history of the fisheries and conservation and how marine ecosystems work and the like, which I've not brought in today's talk. But in short, I mean, the lobster fishery is one of a few examples of fisheries management that's worked relatively well, and in large part because it's not by law, but by tradition, was a community-based fishery where the lobster bottom, in effect, the sea out there was in fact divided in traditional lines into territories based in most of the coast on individual harbors. Each harbor and gang of lobstermen in the harbor had their own turf, which they defended. And they, if one harbor was growing and one was shrinking, there would actually be pushes on the turf, and you would actually, try to defend it by, in worst case scenarios, starting to damage traps from one another, and sometimes shooting wars would break out, but generally respected boundaries between harbors. And the bottoms became essentially common pastures where all the lobstermen in that given harbor know that they're tied to the resource and therefore will not broker any cheating and violation of conservation rules by their fellow lobstermen. Great social sanctions on those things, which are much more effective than trying to have a marine warden in every single boat. So that's, in short, has worked very well. The problem, though, has been that many of the other fisheries have collapsed because the ground fishery has been unfortunately subject to both bad management and enormous overfishing, because the technology we have available now in fishing is industrialized to the point, with fish finders and computer tracking systems and enormous nets and the power available and onboard fish processing plants in the larger vessels, that you can, in fact, catch the last fish. You can chase them all down by the school and scoop them up. And it has been done, and the fisheries collapsed. So we've tried to work out as societies, kind of in a disjointed way, how you would regulate effort, as they say in the jargon, and try to somehow, you can only fish while you've got yourself handcuffed like this and jumping on one foot, or you can only fill the gas tank halfway or fish on Wednesdays. All kinds of things to try to get around the fact that we can now catch the last fish, and it's still sort of an open fishery out there. And unfortunately, a lot of them haven't worked well. The Grand Banks collapsed, and a lot of the fisheries in the Georges Banks had to be closed more than a decade ago because of there were no more fish left, and we were slowly wiping out the remaining fish supply. And that's the situation we find ourselves in now. It's a great tragedy. It affects the lobster fishery in that with the collapse of all these other fisheries and urchins and other things, one of the only fisheries in town, the only way to make a living from fishery was from lobstering, because that fishery wasn't collapsing. So the number of lobstermen has grown as people have left the other fisheries and joined lobstering. And the technology in lobstering has also improved, where people have better boats and are fishing more and more traps. Thus, the fear that perhaps if there are just more and more and more traps, that amongst other things, you're getting so much competitive effort out there that nobody can make any money, and perhaps you might damage the lobster fishery as well if you get too many there. So there's been a lot of effort to limit the number of traps, thus the 800 trap limit and the like. Now, the Maine has now recently recognized a lot of these principles behind community-based management. It's divided the coast into zones, and each of the zones has lobstermen actually take a lot of the decisions which regulate the fishery themselves, and each zone is deciding what their trap limit should be. So in eastern Maine, where there are very few fishermen still, they can still have a higher trap limit, whereas in the central and mid-coast parts, like around here, they're trying to reduce the trap limit because there are so many fishermen. And that's caused a lot of scuffles because it does hurt the big guy who's out there, because let's say you have an 800 trap limit, and you used to have a bunch of guys, a handful of hardcore guys who have 2,000 traps, and maybe a bunch of guys who kind of have other jobs who are fishing, 100 traps. Suddenly, the guys with 2,000 traps are pulling back, and all of that extra lobster bottom's available, and there's a great incentive for everybody who had 100 traps before to fish 800. And if you actually do the math, in the short term, you actually get more traps, because all the guys who had less 800 are going to go for the 800, and there were a lot more of them than there were the big guys. So all kinds of things have been happening. And in short, my answer to what I think of it is, it's problematic, but I, off the top of my head, don't know what the easy solution is to all of it. I mean, it's kind of a messy transitional period, and it's unfortunate, but, I can't think of a better way to do it, than having the lobstermen in these management councils try to set the trap limits. And there are going to be winners and losers and unfair things, but there are in fisheries management all the time, one gear type against another and such. And I think it's just going to have to settle out one way or another. So I don't take a strong position on either side of it. The other element, the tragedy of the collapse of the ground fisheries, I mean, it's horrible what's going on with the decisions as to what to do and how to regulate fishing, whether to cut back the fishing industry further and will it wipe out, the last remaining infrastructure and knowledge base on how to fish altogether. And it's all awful. But the fact is, I mean, we're paying for what happened before. The resource was devastated. And these are the tragic consequences of it, and there's no good way forward. And it's hard to be happy about anything, and I almost try to tune out the ground fishery news because I think it's so sad. And the sad thing is that it came to this point, and that we're having to make these decisions where it's either the fish or the fishermen. Because once the fish go, there won't be any fishermen either. So it's kind of this terrible situation where there's no choice but to wipe out the sort of cultural knowledge base, or let's say to damage the cultural knowledge base further that we depend on for a healthy fishery. I think that's terrible, and it's just a pity that it's come to that. As to the workings as to what we should do now, again, there's no happy silver bullet, I think, to any of it because the resource was laid so low. So that's my opinion, but Anyone else? Yes, please.
I wanted to hear what you had to say about urbanization. You talked a little bit about, what happened in Scarborough, and do you think there's any hope for that?
Oh, this part of the state we're experiencing sprawl, some of the worst in the nation. Greater Portland had the worst sprawl in the entire country over the early part of since 2000. With the most land consumed per unit of the population. And, open spaces are disappearing, and I think towns all over the place are worried about the future character of it, that, it'll all just become cookie-cutter subdivisions, there'll be no open land, and cookie-cutter subdivisions, because of the low density of settlement, everything spread out, end up bankrupting your town government because you've got to build a road and run a school bus and build a sewer line, whether there's 500 houses on that road or 6 houses on that road. And with the subdivisions, you tend to get the sprawl out on the landscape with not any dense concentrations of people. And you need a second fire station, a second police station. The amount of income you bring in is usually not as high as the extra infrastructure payments you're giving out. Thus, the debate about smart growth and what to do about this. Because if you sit around doing nothing, it's not going to end up very nice. And people are starting to realize that. So there's a lot of debates about what to do. One of the solutions that's out there, and as a journalist, I'm just sort of reporting what I've learned out there, but one of them that's popular in the country and makes some sense is to make it possible, as one of the options, to allow higher density building. Because the way a lot of town codes are built now, if you wanted to go build your classic New England village, like Wiscasset or Castine, where you can, or downtown, Portland West End or something, where you can walk from your house and walk to businesses and schools and have mixed use and a church and on-street parking and porches and such, it's illegal. It's against code. You have to, if you build a business, you have to have this much setback from the road and this many parking spaces, and lo and behold, it's called a strip mall. And so it's almost legislated in that you have to do things the bad way in a lot of the codes. And a lot of people are saying we should change things so that you have a mix of options, because a lot of people would be happy to live in a Wiscasset or Castine village, or in a more traditional, 19th and early 20th century urban style environment of, streets and sidewalks and such. And one of the early experiments in that was down in Scarborough, where a couple of developers, rather than build a cookie cutter subdivision on their land, wanted to build a large traditional neighborhood kind of development where you would have mixes of row houses and single family homes and shared areas and brick stoops and parking actually in alleys behind the area, and it would be open to people. It wouldn't be closed off, with gates and pass keys. It would actually be part of the community and such. And that got a lot of people were very fearful, though, of the size of it, because it's counterintuitive still that the way to save open spaces is to build more dense spaces and keep people more concentrated. You look in Europe, though, and that's the way land use is done. You go to the farms, most of the countryside of most countries, it's a village surrounded by fields, and then another village. You're actually not allowed to go building stuff in between in the fields, because that's set aside for the open space and the land. And communities need to come with their own decisions, but it certainly makes sense to have the option of high density available. And I'm not surprised that in the early test balloon got shot down in Scarborough and may elsewhere, because it is a little counterintuitive and it is a little scary for a small community to start, building all of these units at once on this small land, because, it's just a little bit to digest. But I do think that that's going to be the way forward for a lot of towns. Not that you have to do it, but that you'll want that in your toolbox, so that you can have towns that actually have centers and maybe main streets and all those things if you want them, and therefore reduce the pressure on other places which for various reasons you might want to protect, be they the local shipyard or the place where people have always hunted, that it would be nice if that could stay in forestry, or that you would like to have a rural community with farms still, and creating incentives to try to keep that happening. But you need to have growth somewhere, and that gives you one of the options. So that's just a few of the little ideas that are around there. The State Planning Office has a whole suite of material on that as well, if people are interested in digging further on their websites and stuff. There's Smart Growth Maine and a lot of people involved in those things. Also, this book does have all the sources noted in the back down to brass tacks, so you can find people and names of reports and stuff in the back by consulting the page numbers if there's something in a particular section that you become interested in or think I made up. So, yes, please.
In reading the book, I was just fascinated I thought a lot about how difficult it was to come to a new land and start a community. So I was wondering if you could try to add a little color to what you thought everyday community life was like over this period of early settlement.
Early?
Early, and just how you imagine them, and do they have any interaction with other communities down the coast? And the other thing I was curious to just, you talk a little about your process of researching the book, what you did to weave the stories together.
I mean, early days, certainly, your community dynamics, if you're in, early 17th century Maine communities, you were, there weren't any roads. There were probably some, difficult footpaths that you could maybe travel on horseback on, or maybe lead your horse, leading from the little string of 5 or 6 towns that existed in Maine, surrounded by forest. The Native American population, while decimated by some of the diseases that were introduced, were still there, and in fact, all the way up to the Kennebec actually did farming. So you would have passed actually cleared areas with corn farm plots and that kind of stuff. It wasn't a total wilderness landscape. You would have probably, they outnumbered you still to the order of probably 3-4 to 1. So the Native Americans would have clearly been a major element of life passing through and connections, and they knew, how to do stuff, and you probably had to learn a lot of it from them. And they also had access to the beaver pelts, which could be sold for considerable cash income in Europe, because there was you make felt out of that, and felt hats were all the rage at the time. So the towns themselves, the easiest way to get from one to another, or to Boston if you needed to go there, would have been by boat. And you probably didn't do it very often because there was so much to do, because you were basically trying to grow enough food to survive through the long winter, and the growing season was very short, and the winter was very long, and the soil was surprisingly thin and filled with rocks. So, you're having to make all your own tools. The amount of time you would spend doing things, I don't think left much room to be moving around much. More likely, most of your contacts with other Europeans would come when ships from Europe showed up to offload supplies and to pick up whatever your colony had to sell or give to the account. Be they beaver pelts or salt cod and the like. And that was probably your big moment, is whenever any one of those rare supply ships showed up with mail or news of the outside world. Because remember, you're like 80 or 100 people living in the forest, completely separated from anything that you've ever experienced before, in a place that is far, far, far colder than the United Kingdom. It was much colder than it is today. I mean, it was going through a much colder spell of climate than we have now. So I think your contacts were quite limited, and life was pretty no frills, I would say. a great deal of work and not a lot of contact with the rest of the civilization that you'd grown up with. So I imagine it would have been not easy. And a lot of these communities, they were, you'd have a village, and then there'd be fishing stations, which you would have some communication with on the islands. The fishing stations were pretty much more like a mining company town than a community. you have a whole bunch of people who are working on contract there for several years fishing, and it would generally be sort of men-only sort of company town, and they would probably, coming into the village every once in a while when a ship showed up, and I imagine maybe raising a ruckus because their lives were very tedious and difficult. So that's my guess in outline. There's not really, there are letters, and you can piece things together, but it's not easy to get a full snapshot. You kind of have to glean clues from things. My research methods on the history stuff, this is largely a work of synthesis. The mythic history that was sort of created by some of the Boston Brahmins in the late 19th and early 20th century, where you go from the Pilgrims straight over to the French and Indian Wars and all that, has in the universities and in history departments was disproven long ago. In the 1970s and 80s, the history researchers have dug into the documents and published books that about what really happened, and that that was all nonsense, and here are the letters from this guy to that guy and what really happened. But for some reason, none of that actually made it to the public. Historians probably read this book and go, yeah, well, everyone knows that. Well, everyone in the history department knows that. Almost nobody outside the history department knows the whole story. And so a lot of the mission of the book and the history is actually bringing stuff which is known in the academy out to people. And so while I did do some primary research in the early historical period, a lot of it was reading academic journal articles and scholarly works from all sorts of people and integrating the whole picture of what happened. So, we owe the debt to the historians who are named in here for putting together a lot of these stories and assembling the documents. And a lot of those I live in Portland, was able to find at the Portland room of the Portland Public Library or the Maine Historical Society's room, or on interlibrary loan, because our library system in Maine, you can get loans from almost any library in the state. And it's amazing how few things I was not able to somehow get with my public library card and my Maine Historical Society membership. So those are excellent institutions. As you get closer to the present, more and more, once you hit the 19th century, I have more and more primary research because I'm going down avenues that haven't necessarily been gone down by historians in the same way, and there's a lot of microfiche resources from early newspapers, and the resources become more and more thick on the ground and more likely to have been published and be accessible in some way. So you get more of that. And then I'm a journalist, as you approach it, the sort of using the toolbox of investigative journalism and talking to large numbers of people and reading reports and internet and digging into public document rooms and putting stuff together like that. So it's a mix of things. But the history stuff I did not have to invent myself. I'm just carrying the word. Yes, please.
At this stage, after having written this book, and I've obviously spoken to groups such as this over a period of time, are you particularly optimistic or pessimistic as far as the state of Maine is concerned and its future? Is the bottle half full or half empty? And I say this in the context, the way you describe in your book, over a period of the history of Maine, people, whether it be ourselves within the community or people from away, have used and abused all of the resources. And we've seen the decline in some of the basic industries. And then in addition to that, we have the potential in the very near future to lose 1, 2, or 3 military installations, which would be a severe economic blow, which we may never recover from.
Yeah.
Like your thoughts in that context.
I guess in general, I would say that, a lot of the problems are daunting, and some of them obviously don't have any easy solutions. But my overall feeling in the longer term is quite optimistic, particularly when I travel outside of Maine to the rest of the country, because relative to a lot of other places, the proportion of people on the ground who are trying to do the right thing, whatever it is in their own mind, is extremely large in Maine. There's so many people committed to their dream of Maine in one form or another as a place worth saving and that is different from the rest of the country. And there's enough of them. They may be arguing opposite sides of the fence, but there's enough people with that civic commitment that I am rather optimistic, because so many people care about the issues. You read the number of local newspapers and the passion that even small debates over local issues can engender. That's a good thing, that people actually care and will go out fighting for these, for whether or not we should vote for this local item in the town meeting. I mean, those are things that don't happen in a lot of the rest of the country. So that level of civic engagement gives me some optimism. I think, there's undoubtedly how to deal with the growth and the suburbanization of the state is going to be extremely difficult. And I think a lot is going to be lost, particularly in this part of the state, before we work out our tools and stuff. I have more hope that sort of Eastern Maine and Hancock County and stuff can see what's coming in time to sort of make some of the decisions before it's too late about land use and stuff, so that you get more desirable outcomes as a community. I mean, it's sort of, if each town just sort of doesn't do anything, the result is going to be a mess that no one's happy with, because that's the pressures that are being applied. And I don't think anyone's really happy with sort of the sort of runaway suburbanization and growth in a lot of towns and traffic and headaches, and it's just not good for anybody. But to avoid those things, communities have to think ahead and decide, well, what do we want this place to look like in 10 years? What do we value? And different communities are going to have totally different ideas about that, and that's great. But if you want your town to be whatever you want it to be, you're going to have to take proactive steps, because you can't, if you just wait, you're going to lose the town. Probably literally you won't be living there, somebody else will. So I guess that's my message, is everyone has to plan ahead. And in some parts of the state, you can't plan ahead because it's already happened or happening. And so, I don't think there are easy solutions. I don't know how it is that we're going to maintain, commercial waterfront access in York County for commercial fishing as the, commercial fishery is declining and the property values are going up, or the mid-coast. And, that's incredibly difficult issues. But I do, in the overall picture, am pretty optimistic for us as a state. Anyone else? We'll take one or two more if there are any. Or yes, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Could you please share with us one of your favorite characters that you met in your research for this book?
Oh, so many. One of my favorite characters. Well, there are many wonderful people I talked to for the book, and I guess, some of the most compelling stories are the ones I chose to include in the book. Linda Seacott, who lives in New Harbor from the McFarland Shore, the place that's on the cover of here, is very eloquent at talking about the experience of being from a family that goes back to the dawn of time in this place, and has, seen their sort of legacy taken away because of the sort of the differences between the local economy and what people can pay from the outside. And her experience in McDonald's with her father's photograph and stuff is something I found very moving and compelling. But there are, many, many people. Mary Brewer in Boothbay Harbor, the Boothbay Registers, a very well thought out, excellent informed perspective on how waterfront property is changing hands in the changing community, and is able to do it from a perspective where, it's not the native people against the recently arrived people, that everyone's in it together, but the overall effect is sort of this undesired consequences that the town is sort of changing and losing the character which originally attracted people to the area. So there are a lot of them. I don't think I could single out, at least not on the spot, any one or two, but lots of great people. And it wouldn't have been possible to write the book without people giving of their time and energy to make it all possible. Yes, please.
I'm just wondering what's next.
Oh, well, I'm still, I still work as a journalist and a foreign correspondent. I was last month in Albania and Hungary for a couple weeks on assignment, and still do those, sort of assignments to keep the rent and mortgage paid. But I'm working on I've got another book proposal out there which deals with some history stuff, and hopefully in the next week or two I'll know whether or not anyone thinks it's a good idea. So I can report back then, but for the moment I have to keep it under wraps. So if that doesn't work, send me suggestion cards at my website. Yes, please.
Do you have any sense if this book is selling outside of Maine?
Yeah, the question is if I have any sense if the book is selling outside of Maine. It is, but the local support for this book within the state is enormous. My publisher has said they haven't seen, regional support for a title like this, almost ever. That it's really, really enormous. And my analysis as I go around is that much of it is Maine, New Hampshire, and Eastern Mass. And one of the big reasons that is, beyond the subject matter, obviously, is that the chain stores, Barnes & Noble and Borders, in their infinite wisdom, decided that this was going to be a regional title, meaning that if you step outside of New England, there was not a single copy of the book available in any bookstore, Barnes & Noble or Borders, unless the local staff had intervened. So you had to go bookstore by bookstore, which is a little silly because the book, my first book was available nationally in every bookstore, and there's no reason you can't sell one or two in San Francisco or a lot in DC or Philly and New York. But the paperback is going to be coming out in the spring, so hopefully anyone who works at Barnes & Noble or Borders should change their decision when the paperback comes out, which would make it much easier to sell outside of New England. Look, it's a New England bestseller. Yeah. But I've been very delighted with the response for the book. It is a little silly that the rest of the country doesn't even have it distributed to them through the big chains, but I think it got a lot of review attention. I think that'll change when the paperback comes out.
Well, you should be happy that your book is selling so well within New England, because the Longfellow book that recently came out is not available directly through Borders.
Really?
They don't have a copy on the shelf.
Oh. Longfellow biographies not available at Borders. Yeah. I could tell some stories, but the cameras are running, so. All right. Well, I thank you all for coming. And if you have brought your own book you own, I'm, of course, happy to sign it. If you want to own one and don't, we have them here in my first book, Ocean's End. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Colin. We'll give him a little bit of a break because we have this wonderful drawing to do here for these wonderful bags and a signed copy. So pull your tickets out. It's only fitting that we're going to pull these out of a lobster pot. Does anyone want to? Angie, want to? Okay. We should probably. No, I can't. Okay, here we go. Are we ready? Okay. 276745. Oh, sorry. Yay! Okay. Here we go here. 276817. All right. There you go.
This copy was donated to the library the day that we announced the book. A patron came in and said, I happen to have a signed copy that I would like to donate for this purpose. So we thank an anonymous patron.
Wow, there's a lot of them. Yeah. Okay.
And the person may not be here.
Right. This is, people have been.
Attendance wasn't required.
Wow, maybe these people will vote.
Yep, the book, etc.
Okay, it's Kathy Slack. Is Kathy here? Okay, well, we have her phone number, so we'll. Yes. So, ready with pen in hand.
Sell over here. Come and buy a book. Come and buy a bag. If you have some money too, that would be great. All right. He's selling it for 25. Not working at the time. Just the top. That would be great. If you have exact change, that would really help. I don't have them. We'll hang in until we get. We may have some other changes. Oh, how exciting. Now I have change for somebody else. There you go. Move on down the road. Thank you. Sure. That would help. Don't tell him you got it. Hi. How are you? Good to see you. I don't see you. That one's already in here. This comes out in the spring. I'm not sure he didn't specify.